Starting us off at number 10 is the patient. Now, I hate any mental institution story because I know for a fact in the 80s and 90s, horrible things happened in those places and those people were treated like animals. This story was shared by an anonymous person who said their grandma used to work at one of these facilities, but this one was where prisoners were sent who were too mentally unstable to be in actual prison. Now, one of the patients was put there because he had killed his parents and hid their bodies under the floorboards of his house. Every other day, he would bring his mother's body out and do explicit things to it. Necrophiliac, let's just leave it at that. He was caught after his neighbors started complaining about the stench, which was obviously the rotting bodies. Either way, this patient was super fond of the grandma and she happened to live walking distance from the facility. Either way, some patients who were well enough were allowed to walk around the area, and one day she woke up in the middle of the night to intense banging at her door. The patient had escaped and begged her to come inside. Safe to say, he was caught ASAP and the grandma moved house ASAP as well. Coming in at number 9 is Chad Mora. Back in May of 1990, 19-year-old Chad was on his way back to work after picking up some sandwiches from his house. An hour later, his parents ended up going to his hardware store to get some things, but Chad's car was nowhere to be found. The other employees hadn't seen him either, and he never ended up coming home that night. 2 days later, his parents reported him missing, and 3 days after that, his body was found 150 miles away. He had died from carbon monoxide poisoning in his car in a new unlocked garage. Now, the police initially thought it was a suicide, but when his body was examined, his parents could see bruises on his face and body, and his knuckles had been skinned. He had clearly fought with someone. The shirt he was wearing had blood on it, and after looking at the crime scene photos, his parents noticed a jacket on the passenger seat that they knew did not belong to him. When the county sheriff asked for the jacket, Chicago PD told them it had gone missing. Autopsy results also showed the level of carbon monoxide in his body was 74%. Now, if he had died because of it, the level should have been around 50 to 60%, meaning he was already unconscious when he started inhaling it. Hence, someone had killed or thoroughly beat him before planting him at the scene. 3 people ended up getting arrested for his death on the basis of moving from Chicago to Madison very close to the time of his death. Nothing was ever proven though, so we don't know who killed Chad Mora. At number 8, we have the string of homicides. 58-year-old Clark Perry Baldwin was the perpetrator behind a string of countless murders in the early 1990s. In 1991, he was arrested for raping a hitchhiker he had picked up. He had even tried choking her to death too, but she had managed to escape. That same year, he killed Pamela Rose McCall and her unborn child, and in 1992, he was charged with killing 2 women known as Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe. Betty was found frozen naked and left with just her wedding ring, whereas I-90 Jane Doe had been strangled and hit in the head with something, and her body was found mummified. Brutal. Thankfully, DNA recovered from the McCall case got a match last year and was matched with the suspect of 2 other unsolved homicides. It ended up matching Baldwin, and the sick bastard was finally arrested. Yes! Justice! We love a bit of justice. Filling on number 7 slot is the kidnapping. This one was shared by a now deleted Reddit user who used to work at a pretty famous record shop in LA in the 90s. There was one customer in his 20s that used to come in quite regularly and spoke to the user quite a bit. Now, one day while talking, he mentioned how her dad wasn't American, a detail she had never told him herself. Concerned but not too concerned, she just assumed one of her co-workers had told him. The next week, as she was driving home from work, her car ended up breaking down. It was miles to the nearest payphone, but she managed to get there and call a cab. She sat in front of the payphone and waited for a few minutes before it randomly started ringing. Doubtful, she answered it to some guy saying, "Bad luck about your car, talk to me until your ride gets there." Now, she hung up automatically when she realized the voice on the phone belonged to that same customer. He had followed her and trailed her car and called her from somewhere nearby. Within 48 hours, she had quit her job and moved back home with her parents, and found out months later that same customer was arrested for kidnapping. She was this close to becoming his kidnappee. Now at number 6 is Isaac Gerwig. On the 2nd of April 1995, 18-year-old Isaac Gerwig was found dead in the water of this canal in Nieuwegein, Netherlands. Autopsy results showed he had been hit in the head with a blunt object and died of those injuries before being thrown in the water days later. But the Wednesday before his death, Isaac spent time at home celebrating his sister's birthday before walking over to his girlfriend's friend's house. But that was a trip he never came back from. Now, to give some background, the boy was unemployed, but he was a sound guy. He didn't do drugs, he didn't drink, he wanted to join the army, and his girlfriend claimed they were about to get engaged. Upon further investigation, the team then started guessing he'd been mistaken for someone else and then killed because of it. The case gave up no clues, no leads, and most importantly, no suspects. Coming in at number 5 is the baby. Back in May of 1990, 2-month-old Harpreet Paul was left in the backseat of her parents' car near the Coquitlam Centre Mall. The parents left it unlocked, and when they came back 30 minutes later, the baby and car seat had vanished. Now, before going further into the case, why on earth would the parents leave the baby in the car and leave the car unlocked? Is that literally not in the what not to do as a parent manual? Isn't that on the first page, people? The case got barely any press, and the parents also moved city. The kid could very much still be alive, and the police theorized maybe a barren woman could have seen the crying baby and taken her thinking she was saving her. Another version of the story involves a witness claiming they saw a man carrying a crying baby onto the bus around the time of the disappearance. My dear Harpreet Paul, wherever did you end up? At number 4 is Ronald Lee Stoker. In May of 1996, 15-year-old Jean Marie Humble ran away from Peoria's Children's Home Academy, which was a place for troubled kids. As she was walking with no plan, she was offered a ride from Ronald and accepted. And yes, he was a stranger, but she was also extremely desperate to get away. He drove miles into the country to this abandoned farm shed and brought her inside. There, he raped her with a knife, beat her, choked her, and slashed her across the throat and left her for dead. But she wasn't. Superwoman Jean managed to walk a mile to the nearest house to ask for help. Ronald and his car were nowhere to be found by the time authorities ended up getting to Jean. She ended up dying from her injuries a month later, and Ronald was found a year later in Costa Rica, where he had fled. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder and 30 years on top of that for the sexual assault. And honestly, he probably deserved more than that, I'm not gonna lie to you. Filling at number 3 star is Edward Fonda III. Now, Edward was a retired machinist that moved to Springfield Township in Pennsylvania. He was living with his daughter Mary Jane and spent most of his time fixing up the house and creating a lovely garden. In 1993, his wife died, and he at that point, quite old, and needed a cane to get around. According to Mary Jane, his wife's death killed Edward on the inside, but other accounts claim that Edward and Mary Jane weren't even close, so how would she even know that? In August of that year, Mary woke up one morning and claimed she had heard her dad go to the front door. She fell back asleep for a few hours and woke up to find him still not home. She reported him missing, and it was assumed he had wandered off somewhere, but that was unlikely. Then his kids changed their story and claimed he had committed suicide, also unlikely. Then authorities started suspecting it was Mary Jane who killed her father for unknown reasons. She had no alibi for the hours she said she was asleep, and then her story started changing. Mary then claimed she was on a lot of medication at the time and could have done something she doesn't remember. An X was also weirdly marked on her calendar for that day at 8 a.m. Was it premeditated? No one has been able to figure it out, and no one will. Now, at number 2 is Cartierville John Doe. On the 1st of March 1991, a body was found in the Cartierville suburb of Montreal. The man was around 30 to 50 years old and was found in a box wrapped in garbage bags. The box was disposed of in the city dump, but it was a trail of blood that led someone to find the box. It had been snowing quite a bit, but the box wasn't that covered, meaning it hadn't been there for that long. When authorities finally examined the body, they were horrified. The man had been stabbed to death 127 times all over his body, and I mean all over. His face, his genitals, his eyeballs, everywhere. His hands had also been cut off, and the extent of his wounds made him virtually impossible to identify. Investigators believe it was a crime of passion, but there's just no way. I refuse to believe that. I get hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but come on, what could this guy have done to his partner for them to go and do that? Really? And finally, at number 1 is Leah Ulbridge, October 29th, 1995. 24-year-old Leah Ulbridge was dragged to death by a speeding car for 4 painful miles. The route went from the South Meadows of Hartford to Goodwin Park in Wethersfield. Officials believe it's still the largest crime scene ever recorded, and I can't even think of the gore that was left along the route. Officers said they found a trail of thick blood as well as pieces of her body and clothing. Apparently, a witness saw her in an argument with someone in a Nissan Altima that morning at 5 a.m. What happened next is very convoluted. Either she tried to get out of the car herself, or she was pushed out with her arms still trapped in the seatbelt. A newspaper delivery driver saw the car with Leah struggling attached to it and tried following it, but it sped away from him. She was so torn apart by the end of it that officers identified her solely by her tattoos. Leah had lived a very troubled life until then. She had been married with 2 kids who had been taken off her due to her drug problem. The route where she had an argument was also known to be an area populated with sex workers. And in the 90s and even now, sex workers usually go missing or are killed and no one is looking for them. It is a huge problem. Starting us off with number 10 is the freezer. January 26, 1991. That morning, police cars were dispatched to check up on 6 Taco Bells in the Irving area. The dispatch occurred because at 5 a.m. that same day, 2 teens had found a Taco Bell takeout bag containing $1,390 in it. Police eventually came upon one branch that was dark and locked, so they slipped in through the drive-through window. At the back of the restaurant, police found 4 dead bodies, all of whom had been shot to death. 2 were cousins, and one was not only a young mother, but also pregnant at the time of her death. The 2 teens, Jerome Green and Jesse Carlos San Miguel, were actually Taco Bell employees and had apparently forced their way in when another employee was taking out the trash. One of the victims was the assistant manager who handed them the money. Another victim was just a friend outside waiting for his friends to get off work, but was somehow forced inside as well. The 2 asked the hostage to give them a good reason not to kill them before shooting them all execution style. Green and San Miguel were charged with the murder, and San Miguel was given the lethal injection in 2000, and Green's release date is currently 2043. Coming in at number 9 is The Window, October 16th, 1991. Former merchant mariner George Henner drove his Ford Ranger pickup right through the front window of Luby's cafeteria. At first, diners thought it was an accident, but soon realized they were wrong when George stepped out of the truck with a pistol and began to open fire. Having had a history of making super misogynistic threats and calling women vipers, George was firing at the women more than the men. He was even dragging customers out from underneath tables and then shooting them point blank. This whole massacre went on for about 12 minutes before he was shot multiple times by responding policemen. However, those shots didn't kill him, and he eventually shot himself and committed suicide after he was running low on bullets. The Luby's massacre was actually the worst mass shooting to ever occur by a single gunman in American history. At number 8, we have Lisa Bauer, March 20th, 1998. Lisa Bauer's parents drove over to their 36-year-old daughter's house after getting a worrisome call from her sister Pam. That morning, the sisters were meant to go on a road trip out of town, but Lisa had failed to show up in the morning, and her phone had been unresponsive. When the parents got to her house, they found Lisa dead, lying in a pool of her own blood, and it seemed like she'd been shot in the heart with an arrow. Who the hell uses a bow and arrow to kill someone in this day and age? Like, that is so archaic. Either way, for some backstory, Lisa was divorced with a son, but her ex-husband was not in their lives. Investigation showed there was no forced entry into the apartment and nothing was stolen. The arrow used to kill her was believed to be shot out of a compound bow, but that's still very strange. She had no known enemies, but a murder like that just didn't seem random, and the case till this day is unsolved. Filling number 7 slot is Denny's. I've been to Denny's at 2 a.m. way more times than I'd like to admit, but oh my god, their shakes are insane, you guys. But also, one milkshake is 1,000 calories, so I mean, I'm not trying to have most of my caloric intake for the day through one milkshake, but I mean, I have done it in the past, and I don't regret it. Sue me. Either way, let's get into it. February 3rd, 1996. 38-year-old Cyrus Salehi was working the graveyard shift at an LA Denny's and had also recently acquired partial ownership of the Reseda location. Late that night, 20-year-old Ruben Lopez walked into the restaurant with a gun. It was a robbery. Cyrus completely complied and handed over $400 from the cash register, but Lopez went ahead and shot him in the chest anyway. Cyrus sadly died from his injuries, but justice was served because Lopez and his getaway driver Samuel Martinez were convicted of the murder and sentenced to life without parole. Crime has its consequences, people. You want to do the crime, you gotta do the time. Now at number 6 is the final date, May 15th, 1990. 22-year-old James So had finally asked out his decade-long crush, Kelly Tan Ahong. That night, he left the house at 7:30 and met up with Kelly at East Coast Park, which was a park and beach in Singapore. They were sitting near Amber Beacon Tower, talking and being cute, and around 10:15 p.m., two men walked by them going towards the top of the tower. The two didn't think twice about the men since the beacon was insanely popular and visited by everyone. At 10:30, the men, now wearing masks, attacked them from behind. One of them stabbed James in the back while the other stabbed Kelly in the neck. She tried running to the ground floor to get away from the man, but when James found her, she was already bleeding out. He couldn't pick her up as he wasn't strong enough, so he ran to the Singer Inn, a nearby restaurant, and asked for help while being covered in blood and eventually passing out. By the time he woke up in the hospital, he was told that Kelly had died before any help could arrive. No weapons were found and the men were never identified. Imagine waiting a decade to ask out your crush for that to happen on your first date. I can't even imagine. Coming in at number 5 are the rappers. September 7th, 1996. Infamous rapper Tupac was in Las Vegas celebrating a business partner's birthday. That night, Orlando Anderson, a suspected Southside Compton Crip, was spotted in the lobby of their hotel after trying to steal Tupac's Death Row Records medallion a few days prior. The rapper weighed his way to Club 662, and around 11 p.m. Tupac's car was stopped by police because of loud music and no license plates. The plates were later found in the boot of the car and the rapper was let go without a ticket. 15 minutes later, at a red light, a Cadillac pulled up next to the car and someone shot inside it with 4 bullets hitting Tupac. He died of his injuries 6 days later. The Death Row label had been feuding with their biggest competitor, Bad Boy, for a very long time, and 6 months later, one of Bad Boy's rappers, Biggie Smalls, was shot and killed just like Tupac. Both rappers had been friends when both of them were under Bad Boy, but he switched over to Death Row Records after he went to jail. The feud was bad enough that people somehow suspected that Biggie had somehow been involved in killing Tupac, but he had a solid alibi, so in the end, both cases stumped the police. At number 4 is the fast food killer. I used to be a fast food fiend before I realized that's a fast and surefire way to give myself high cholesterol and weight gain, so ain't nobody got time for that. February 15th, 1997. Convicted robber and dishwasher Paul Dennis Reed Jr. threw a plate at one of his fellow employees at Shoney's before getting fired. The next day, Paul went on a fast food killing massacre. He made his way to Captain D before it opened for the day, and I'm guessing he targeted it because that was owned by Shoney's as well, and he used to work there. There, he robbed the place and shot the manager Steve Hampton and an employee, Sarah Jackson. A month later, he ambushed 4 McDonald's employees, shooting and killing them all. A month after that, he hit a Baskin-Robbins in Clarksville, Tennessee. First, he kidnapped 2 of the employees and then later killed them in Dunbar Cave State Park. And then, in a plot twist turn of events, a month after that, Paul stood in the same Shoney's that fired him, asking for his job back. He attempted to kidnap his ex-boss at gunpoint, but was eventually arrested and outsmarted. He was sentenced to death 7 times over, but died through natural causes in 2013. That's like continuous months of just fast food killings. Get over it, dude. You got fired. Get another job. Filling on number 3 slot is Herbert. In the early 90s, Herbert Baumeister, an Indianapolis local, would lure gay men back to his pool house and then kill them. All his victims were of similar build and appearance, and he would take them back to his house and strangle them before dumping their remains in the woods behind his house. His son Eric even found the remains of a victim one day while he was playing in the backyard, and that was probably traumatizing for the kid. Eventually, police were tipped off by a guy called Tony Harris, who claimed a gay bar patron going by the name Brian Smart had killed his friend and attempted to kill him during a pool host erotic asphyxiation. Kinky. Pretty kinky, I'm not gonna lie. Eventually, Brian Smart was identified to be Herbert, but when they got to his house, both him and his wife Julie refused to let them search their house. But by June 1996, Julie was scared of Herb due to his erratic mood swings and divorced him and finally consented to the search. The remains of 11 bodies were found and the warrant for his arrest had been made. But knowing he was screwed, Herb fled to Ontario and shot himself in the head at Pinery Provincial Park. The suicide note he left behind blamed his failing business and marriage for his suicide, but failed to mention anything about the murders. So he never confessed, but it was pretty obvious it was him. Now, at number 2 is the yogurt shop. December 6th, 1991. Firefighters were rushing to the scene of a fire blazing inside of a, I can't believe it's, yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. When they finally got there, the men found the dead bodies of 4 young girls in the back of the store. 2 were identified as employees, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, and Harbison's younger sister, Sarah. It looked like they had planned a sleepover at the shop after closing up, but they were found bound, gagged, and all shot in the head. Eventually, 4 men were arrested in connection to the murder, 2 of which actually confessed, but then rumors started going around that the confessions were forced. The 2 that confessed were convicted, and the other 2 had their charges dropped. However, in 2009, both arrested men were released after lack of evidence against them. There was only 1 piece of DNA found at the crime scene, and it belonged to none of those 4 men. Most of the evidence was most likely lost in the fire, and therefore the culprit was never found and never brought to justice. And finally, at number 1 is Brown's Chicken, January 8th, 1993. Robbers had taken a Brown's Chicken and pasta located in Palatine, Illinois. Before doing anything drastic, they thought they should have a quick bite to eat, so they just sat there chewing on some chicken before making any rash decisions. The robbers then forced 7 employees to walk into the freezer at gunpoint. Hours later, after the robbers had taken off with $2,000, police found the bodies of the owners as well as 5 employees shot to death at the eatery. The case remained unsolved until March of 2002, and you know what helped them solve the case? The saliva on those preserved chicken bones that those people were eating. That's right, you want to eat that badly before you shoot people? That's what you get. A woman went to the police claiming her ex had bragged about the killings, and she also mentioned someone called Juan Luna, who was a former Browns employee. The saliva matched Luna, and he was convicted and sentenced to life. The woman's ex-boyfriend was next in line in the conviction, and he too was sentenced 2 years later. Starting us off at number 10 is Rosie Tapia Part 1, August 13th, 1995. Loween Tapia and her husband had just gotten home to their Salt Lake City apartment after a date night. Their 3 kids were asleep since their eldest 18-year-old Amelia had been babysitting them. At 2 a.m., everybody was home, but by 5:45 a.m., Loween went to check in on them again to find their door closed, which it never was. But by 5:45 a.m., Loween went to check in on them again to find their door closed, which it never was. Her second child, 6-year-old Rosie, was missing, and someone had clearly taken her. The window was ajar, the screen was gone, and the blinds were heavily damaged. Loween immediately woke everyone up, called the police, and the search began. Rosie's 4-year-old little brother claimed a bearded man was in his room and had told him to go back to sleep. During interviews, police found out something key from Amelia about the day before. She had taken Rosie to the playground and left her there to play on her own. But around 7:30 p.m., an unknown man knocked on the door with Rosie in his arms. He claimed that she had been kicked by another kid on the slide, but he seemed overly nervous and kept stuttering. When he left, Rosie revealed that she hadn't been hurt at the playground at all, and she had no idea how the man knew her name. So already, guys, things are suspicious, like who the hell is that dude? Coming in at number 9 is Rosie Tapia Part 2. The next morning at around 10 a.m., a jogger found the body of a small girl in the Jordan River Canal. The body was Rosie's, and she was fully clothed, and initially investigators reported that she had wandered off and drowned. Autopsy results showed that the trauma her body sustained were consistent with rape and drowning, meaning he had drowned her before raping her. So now we are looking for a pedophilic murderer. Amelia's description of the unknown man led more witnesses to come forward, saying he'd been sitting on the playground bench, just watching the kids, not even supervising a child of his own. The man wasn't found despite the DNA that was recovered from under Rosie's fingernails, so the case is still unsolved. At number 8, we have Sherry Pearson, September 12th, 1993. Firefighters rushed to a house on fire located on Garden Street, Kendallville, Indiana. Sherry's neighbor saw smoke pouring from the windows of the house and promptly called the police. By the time firefighters got there, the house had already been ablaze for 45 minutes already, and upon entering, they found 27-year-old Sherry Pearson dead in the living room. Now, thankfully, her 2 children were visiting their dad at the time, since the couple had separated a few months prior, but were apparently trying to work things out. Now, the case was originally ruled as an accident, blaming faulty wiring for the fire starting, but that wasn't the case. Investigators realized the fire started in the bedroom, and some type of accelerant had been poured all over the bedroom, as well as in other spots around the house. So this was now a case of arson, and more importantly, homicide. The batteries on the fire alarm had also been removed, meaning that they were never going to save her. Autopsy results showed that Sherry had been injected with some unknown foreign substance before her death. Officers concluded she had been drugged before the fire was set, but the culprit was never found. Filling our number 7 slot is Nicola Payne, December 14th, 1991. 18-year-old Nicola was going to the shops to pick up some clothes for her son. The walk from her boyfriend's house to her parents was quite short and should have taken her around 10 minutes, even in super bad conditions. But somehow, out of nowhere, she just vanished. Even sniffer dogs and helicopters could find zero trace of Nicola, but one anonymous man apparently could. He kept calling the Payne family, claiming he saw a man carrying a drunk individual along that road. The case went cold for another 5 years, despite a lot of excavation having taken place. 2 men were arrested for the murder, but both had been found not guilty due to lack of evidence. What's important to not forget here is that sex worker Barbara Finn also disappeared around the same time Nicola did, and both had pretty similar physical features. Authorities hypothesized it could have been Scottish serial killer Peter Tobin, but again, zero evidence. Now at number 6 is Claire Morrison, December 19th, 1992. This one's a tough one because there are so many conflicting stories of what she was doing the night before she died. On the 18th, 13-year-old Claire Morrison was at Geelong Mall in Australia, and she told her friend she was going to catch the bus home to get some money, but that's the last time they would ever see her alive. Witnesses claim they saw Claire drunk walking around town, and 18-year-old Shane McLaren told police he saw her getting into a blue car with 2 men, which later turned out to be a complete lie. Claire's brother Andrew said her and her friends went to the cliffs that overlooked Bell Beach, but she failed to leave with them when they left. The next morning, her body was found near the beach in horrific condition. She had been strangled, beaten, she had neck and head injuries, and had also been mangled by a shark, hence the exact cause of death could not be found. Since Shane was the only one who was linked to the case and who had also lied about it, he was automatically the number 1 suspect, and the fact he was addicted to crystal meth just didn't help his case at all. Regardless, someone did hurt Claire before throwing her into the water to be left dead for sharks, but we just don't know who it was. Coming in at number 5 are The Rocks, August 27th, 1991. 28-year-old Marcia Gippin and her friend Stanley were driving west on the I-70 to pick up her 2 daughters who were staying with her parents. As the two went under the Manhattan Road underpass in Putnam County, Indiana, 2 huge rocks, both heavier than 15 pounds each, were thrown on them from the overpass. The first rock broke through her windshield, hitting Marcia in the head, killing her instantly. The second one bounced off the hood and hit Stanley, but he somehow managed to stop the car. As he was trying to stop other cars for help, another 2 rocks were thrown over, hitting a truck driven by 23-year-old Kimberly Shuttler. The rock shattered the leg of her passenger James, but she was thankfully uninjured. James and Stanley were airlifted to a hospital, but Marcia ended up being killed due to multiple critical injuries. Witnesses claim they saw 2 males in their teens getting away from the overpass in a dark truck, but the worst part of all of this was that this wasn't even an isolated incident. It had happened a lot in the months leading up to August, and 7 other motorists had reported the incidents. The kids that were responsible for the deaths were never found or brought to justice. At number 4 is Diane Orgett, April 10th, 1998. Around Good Friday, a Florida woman called Diane Orgett was reported missing by her mum. Her mum went on to say Diane suffered from addiction and mental illness and was drawn to and easily trusting of men, especially men with money. Now, it's still up in the air whether she left on purpose because of a man or whether it was actually an abduction. A few days after her disappearance, she left a worrying message on her mum's answering phone. In a message, she screams, "Help, help," before you hear a sound of some sort of scuffle, and then someone else saying, "Hey, gimme that," before the message ends. She tried calling back, but there was no answer. So at this point, okay, it sounds like she's being held hostage by this man, or maybe this was a romantic situation gone very wrong. 2 days later, the tip of Diane's middle finger was found on the side of the road she'd been seen walking down. A week later, her clothes were found folded in a bag and disposed of in the freezer of a random convenience store. Totally normal location to do that. Another bag filled with her makeup was found in another store, and it was labeled Diane. Again, the case was just never solved, but I have a feeling that Diane is dead, based off the fact that someone had cut off her fingers and taken her clothes. Filling our number 3 slot is the British millionaire, December 10th, 1996. 54-year-old millionaire Richard Watson was on his way home, and as soon as he entered his property, he heard a gunshot. His stepdaughter claimed he said, "No, no, get away from me, not again, leave me alone, get away from me." When she finally stepped outside, she saw that Richard had been shot in the neck twice by a man wearing joggers. 6 months later, his wife Linda and daughter Amanda were arrested in a sting operation at Gatwick airport for the murder of Richard. The police were convinced the two had hired a hitman to kill him. In the months leading up to his murder, he'd been visited by two men outside his family home. There had been two break-ins at his office, and a man had even been caught writing down his number plate. Maybe Linda and Amanda wanted the money but didn't want the blame, so they hired a hitman. People always have some kind of beef with rich people anyway, so maybe it was just someone who Richard had wronged. We don't know. Now at number 2 is Carmen Van Huss, March 22nd, 1990. 19-year-old Indianapolis local Carmen Hope Van Huss was on her way back from the hospital after visiting her sick grandma. She dropped off her brother and dad before going home to her own apartment and arriving at around 11 p.m. Neighbors saw her with a man talking and laughing going towards her apartment. At around 1 or 1:30 a.m., neighbors heard her shouting, get off me," followed by footsteps leaving the apartment. Instead of calling the police like any normal person, the neighbors called the landlord, and a noise complaint notice was just left on her door. I'm pretty sure if I heard my neighbor shouting "get off me," I would not call the landlord, I would bloody call the police. Then the next morning, after failing to show up to her shift at work, her manager was worried and alerted Carmen's dad, James. James had also been trying to reach Carmen's phone, but with no result, he went to her apartment. There, he found her door unlocked and the whole apartment in utter chaos. Carmen's partially clothed, stabbed body was on the floor, and it looked like she had also been Nothing was stolen, and all her exes were interviewed, but they had all been out of state at the time of the crime. Her case remains cold. And finally, at number 1 is Norway's most well-known murder, May 6, 1995. 17-year-old Birgitte Teng's body was found dead in a bush by the side of a dirt road. The night before, Birgitte traveled to downtown Kopervik, and right before midnight, she hiked a ride to the city. Eyewitnesses remembered seeing her walking down the main street, but that was the last live sighting of her. Her body was found with her stockings at her ankles, her dress pulled up, and her head was almost completely smashed open. The weapon, a 23-kilogram bloody rock, was found next to her. Further investigation showed she had been dragged to the location before being raped and killed only 400 meters away from her own home. The first break in the case was the blonde hair that she was found clutching that was not hers. The police spent ages trying to find a long-haired blonde man before DNA testing came back again, saying the hair actually was hers. The biggest suspect in the case was her cousin, who was seen acting extremely weird during her funeral. He also had a history of inappropriately touching a girl and public exposure. After being interrogated for 180 hours, he ended up confessing but later took it back. He won the case due to lack of evidence, and her killer is still at large. And I mean, you guys, we've seen so many cases where someone, after being interrogated for literally days on end, will just confess because they think they've done it when they actually haven't, and they're just in a state of delirium. And that could have very well been Brigitte's cousin.